The night was darker than ink, and the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Far below the ridge, the wind moved through the leaves in a slow, uneasy whisper, like nature itself knew something terrible was about to begin. High above that vast black valley, a small group of American Rangers stood alone on a narrow ridge, gripping their rifles, listening, waiting. They did not know the exact number of men climbing toward them, but they knew it was large, larger than anything a single squad should ever have to face. Somewhere below, hidden in the shadows, 2,000 Japanese soldiers were beginning their silent climb. For a moment, everything felt still. The moon was trapped behind heavy clouds. The air was hot, almost wet, carrying the smell of soil, sweat, and distant gunpowder. The Rangers had fought before. They had survived ambushes, marches, and the endless fear of the Pacific Front. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt final. One Ranger later wrote, "It was the night the world disappeared. We could see nothing. Only hear them coming." He meant the footsteps, soft at first like a strange rhythm carried by the earth. Then louder. Then closer. Branches snapped. Metal clicked. Quiet voices moved in the dark. The ridge under the Rangers' boots felt small, like a lonely island in a sea of approaching danger. And this is where our story begins. This is the story of how one squad, tired, dirty, hungry, and far from home, held a ridge against a force almost 20 times their size. How a handful of men stood between survival and collapse. And how, in the darkest hours of the night, courage rose from fear, and strength came from the simple desire to protect the man standing beside you. Perhaps this was where it all began, not with a shot, not with a shout, but with the heavy silence of men who understood what they were about to face. The ridge itself was narrow, like the spine of some giant creature sleeping beneath the earth. On one side, the land fell sharply into a maze of jungle vines and muddy slopes. On the other, it dropped even farther into a valley filled with tall grass, broken trees, and shadows that moved with every breath of wind. The Rangers had chosen this spot because it gave them a view of both sides. But it also meant they were exposed. If the Japanese broke through here, the entire line behind them could collapse. They had no choice but to hold. The night air felt heavy, filled with the smell of damp leaves and old fire pits. The Rangers' boots sank into soft soil. Their uniforms clung to their skin. Mosquitoes swarmed around their faces, searching for open skin. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, a long echoed sound that seemed out of place on a battlefield. Every small noise felt louder than it should. Every breath felt important. One Ranger rubbed dirt on his hands to keep them from sweating. Another whispered a quiet prayer. Someone checked his ammo again even though he had already counted it 3 times. These were small actions, but they were the only things that helped keep their minds steady. They stood in silence, waiting. Behind them, the sky finally gave a small glimmer of moonlight. It was faint, only a thin silver line slipping through the clouds. But it was enough to see the faint shape of the ridge. Enough to see each other's faces, young, tired, eyes wide with focus. Enough to see the world not as soldiers, but as human beings who wanted to live through the night. Then it happened. A sudden shout from below. A sharp crack of breaking wood. And then the sound changed, no longer footsteps but running, rushing, hundreds of bodies pushing through the jungle all at once. The calm was gone. The darkness was alive. The first wave was coming. The Rangers lifted their rifles, leaned into the dirt, and waited for the moment when the shapes would appear from the black. This ridge, once quiet, once forgotten, was about to become one of the most desperate battlegrounds of the Pacific War. But to understand why these men were here, why they had been sent to this lonely height, and why this ridge mattered so much, we must step back and look at the world that led them here. Many months before this night, the Pacific was burning. The war had spread across islands, oceans, and coastlines, turning peaceful landscapes into fields of metal and fire. Japanese forces had moved quickly, capturing land after land, fighting with skill, discipline, and a deep sense of duty that came from years of military tradition. They were trained to advance no matter the cost. Retreat was unthinkable. Surrender was dishonorable. It made them powerful. It made them feared. The United States had entered the war with strength, but the Pacific Islands presented challenges no army had prepared for. Dense forests, hidden hills, steep cliffs, thick heat, swarms of insects, and an enemy that knew the land better than any map could describe. Every ridge, every trail, every patch of jungle became a small war on its own. And this particular ridge, this narrow rocky line in the middle of a forgotten island, had become important not because of its size or its beauty, but because it overlooked a key supply route. If the Japanese took it, they would be able to attack American forces from above and cut through their defenses. If the Americans held it, they could protect the valley and stop an entire division from advancing. So command chose a ranger squad to defend it, not because they were many but because rangers were trained for the impossible. They moved fast. They fought with skill. They stayed calm where others panicked. But even the best could feel fear. And on this night they felt it deeply. The path up the ridge was carved by rainwater over centuries. It twisted and climbed like a snake, narrow and steep, forcing anyone who approached to come in single file. During the day it was hard to climb. At night, nearly impossible. Yet the Japanese were coming anyway. They moved with quiet determination, climbing step by step, knowing they had the numbers to overwhelm whatever stood above them. The Rangers had placed their machine gun in a shallow rise near the center of the ridge. The barrel was dark in the moonlight. The gunner adjusted its position again. His hands were steady but his heartbeat was loud in his head. Farther down the line, two men crouched behind a fallen tree, using its thick trunk as cover. They whispered to each other, sharing a short joke to ease the tension, though their smiles faded as soon as the noise below grew louder. Another man lay flat on his stomach, pressing his ear to the ground. He could feel vibrations, soft, rhythmic, moving upward. He lifted his head and whispered, "They're coming faster now." The squad leader, a man who had seen more battles than he wished to remember, stood quietly with one knee on the dirt. He scanned the slope, searching for movement. His expression was calm, but behind his eyes was a storm of calculations. Angles, distances, timing. When to fire. When to pull back. When to throw grenades. When to hold and when to risk everything. He knew the truth. If they failed tonight, there might be no one left to tell the story. The jungle below seemed to open as dozens of dark shapes pushed through the trees. They were not clear at first, only shadows against shadows, flickering with each flash of moonlight. But the Rangers could hear them now. Boots on soil. Metal rattling. A voice shouting orders. The click of rifles being raised. Then came the first flare. A bright, sudden burst of light shot into the sky, tearing open the darkness. The ridge lit up like day. Every leaf, every rock, every face became visible. The Rangers squinted against the brightness. The Japanese shielded their eyes. And in that frozen second, both sides saw the truth. This was not a small scouting party. This was an army. When the flare faded, the night fell even darker than before. And then the shouting began. Japanese soldiers rushed forward in waves, their steps pounding against the earth. Their voices blended into one rising cry, fierce and full of determination. The Rangers steadied their rifles. The squad leader breathed deeply once, then gave the only command that mattered. Hold the ridge. The night exploded. Rifles cracked. Muzzle flashes lit the air. The machine gun roared, sending sparks flying from the barrel. The first wave of Japanese soldiers fell, but more came from behind. Grenades burst in the trees. Dirt flew into the air. Leaves rained down like pieces of the night being torn apart. The Rangers fought with everything they had, each man firing, ducking, reloading, shouting warnings, calling out targets. But even as they fought, even as they held the line, they knew this was only the beginning. The enemy forces kept climbing. More shadows appeared. More voices rose. More footsteps shook the ground. The ridge felt smaller with each passing minute. Still the Rangers did not break. They held their ground, their bodies pressed low, their breaths sharp and fast. The squad leader moved along the line, shouting support, giving orders, dragging a wounded man behind cover. The machine gun overheated. They cooled it with water, steam rising into the night. The Japanese climbed and climbed, stepping over fallen soldiers, pushing upward with relentless strength. For them, this ridge was more than a hill. It was a chance to break through, to prove their courage, to win a victory that would echo across the island. For the Rangers it was survival. As the battle grew louder, the moon finally slipped out from behind the clouds. A pale, cold light washed over the ridge. For a brief moment the world became clear again. The Rangers could see the valley far below, the tops of the trees, the distant curve of the coastline. They could see each other's faces, sweating, breathing hard, eyes wide with focus. It was beautiful in a strange, haunting way. A battlefield caught between darkness and moonlight. Perhaps this was where the true story begins, not with the enemy climbing the slope, not with the shots fired, but with the simple truth that in moments like these, ordinary men discover parts of themselves they never knew existed. The night was still young. The ridge was still under attack. And the Rangers still had many hours to survive. But they had taken the first step. They had held their ground. And the ridge for now was theirs. The battle on the ridge had begun, but to truly understand what was happening that night, we have to step back and look at the long road that brought both sides here. Because this ridge, this narrow strip of earth, was not just a random point on a map. It was the result of months of battles, years of war, and the weight of choices made far above the heads of the men fighting on it. Long before the Rangers dug their boots into this soil, the Pacific had become one of the most brutal battlegrounds in modern history. The islands were scattered like stepping stones across an ocean that stretched farther than the human eye could see. Some were large, some were tiny, but each held a strategic value that made it worth fighting over. Whoever controlled these islands controlled the sea routes, and whoever controlled the sea routes controlled the war. The Japanese Empire understood this with absolute clarity. They moved quickly through the Pacific, capturing territory with incredible speed. They built airfields, supply bases, and strong defensive lines. Their soldiers trained to fight to the very last breath. They had grown up learning that honor mattered more than survival, and loyalty to the emperor was greater than loyalty to life itself. This made them powerful. It also made them terrifying. When the fighting reached this particular island, an island covered in thick jungle and sharp ridges, the Japanese forces had already established strong positions. They had dug tunnels into hillsides, built hidden bunkers, and created paths that only they could navigate. They knew the land as if it were part of their own bodies. The Americans, on the other hand, were newcomers. They had arrived recently, stepping into dense heat, buzzing insects, constant rain, and a terrain so difficult that even the simplest movement felt like a battle of its own. Many soldiers were shocked by the conditions. Everything was wet. Everything smelled of mud, sweat, gun oil, and rotting plants. Food spoiled quickly. Boots filled with water. Rifles rusted overnight. But the Rangers were different. They had been trained for missions exactly like this. Fast, dangerous, deep inside territory where the enemy was strongest. They moved quietly, struck quickly, and adapted to any environment. And it was for this reason, and this reason alone, that command sent them to the ridge. The ridge was not tall. It was not wide. It was not the kind of place a traveler would ever notice. But its position made it priceless. It overlooked a valley that held a key supply route used by American forces. If the Japanese captured the ridge, they could fire down on convoys, block reinforcements, and split the American line in half. One ridge. One squad. One fragile line between holding the island or losing it. The Rangers reached the ridge in the late afternoon, after hours of climbing through mud and tangled vines. The sun had been burning hot during the day, and steam rose from the ground like breaths from the earth. The air was so thick that every inhale felt like pulling water into the lungs. Leaves brushed their faces. Branches scratched their arms. Their uniforms were soaked in sweat long before they reached the top. As they climbed, they passed signs of earlier fights. Fallen trees, empty helmets, torn webbing, and the silent bodies of soldiers who had fought on this very ground days before. These reminders weighed heavily on them. This ridge had already claimed lives. It would claim more. They just hoped they would not be among them. When they finally reached the top, they studied the land. The ridge was narrow, only wide enough for a small group to defend. But this was both a weakness and a strength. The Japanese could only climb from two paths. One to the east, one to the west. If the Rangers positioned themselves correctly, they could hold off even a much larger force. Or at least, that was the hope. The squad leader, a man named Sergeant Hale, walked the length of the ridge slowly, studying every inch. He knelt to touch the soil. He looked at the trees that could hide enemy movement. He checked the slope angles. He thought about where the machine gun should go, where the riflemen should be placed, where they could pull back if necessary. Hale was not a loud man. He didn't yell, didn't show fear, and didn't waste words. The men trusted him because he had kept them alive through storms, ambushes, and long nights on other islands. But that night even he felt a tension he could not hide. He muttered quietly, "This is going to be bad." And everyone heard him. Even though he wasn't speaking loudly. Even though he tried to hide the worry in his voice. These words settled in the air like dust, reminding each man that they stood on a ridge that history might forget, but death would not. As night approached, the heat slowly faded. The jungle sounds changed, from daytime calls to the strange, low songs of insects and night birds. The sky darkened. The air cooled. Shadows stretched across the earth. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled far beyond the hills. The men ate silently. A small piece of bread. A handful of rice. A can of cold beans shared between two men. They drank warm water from their canteens and wiped sweat and grime from their faces. One man wrote a quick note to his family, folded it, and tucked it inside his jacket, just in case. Another man cleaned his rifle with steady hands. A third stared out into the dark valley, trying to calm the storm inside his chest. They were ready. Or as ready as they could ever be. But they did not yet know the full scale of what was coming. They knew Japanese scouts had been seen in the valley. They knew a large force was nearby. But they had not expected 2,000 soldiers. Not until it was too late to run. At dusk, a forward scout returned with fear in his eyes. He was breathing hard, covered in scratches, and he spoke in a low, urgent voice. "They're coming," he said. "A lot of them. Maybe hundreds. Maybe more." Sergeant Hale stopped what he was doing. "How far?" The scout swallowed. "Maybe an hour. Maybe less." In that single moment, everything changed. The Rangers scattered into position. The machine gun team set up the tripod, fed ammunition, and tested the firing arc. Riflemen spread out behind fallen logs and small rises in the earth. The grenades were placed within easy reach. Every man took his position and looked down into the dark valley, waiting for shapes to move through the shadows. And then, slowly, the night began to shift. It started with a soft rustle, like wind brushing against dry leaves. But the air was still. A second rustle followed, then a third, then many more. The Rangers leaned forward, ears sharpened, eyes searching the black below. And then they heard it clearly, the soft thud of boots on soil. More boots. Dozens. Then hundreds. Then a drum-like rhythm as entire companies of Japanese soldiers moved in unison up the slopes. The jungle seemed to shiver. Birds flew out of the canopy. Even the air felt heavier, like the earth itself was preparing to hold its breath. One ranger whispered, "It's them." Another whispered, "There are too many." Sergeant Hale didn't let fear spread. "Stay low," he said. "Wait for my signal." But fear was not something that could be ordered away. It crawled across their skin, settled in their stomachs, and tightened around their throats. Still they stayed still. They held their rifles. They did not run. Because running meant death. Holding the ridge meant a chance, no matter how small. Below them, the shapes began to appear. First a few. Then many more. Quiet silhouettes moving in tight lines, stepping around rocks, sliding through tree roots, climbing with steady, practiced discipline. They carried rifles, bayonets, grenades. Some carried ropes. Some carried climbing tools. Their faces were focused, hard, and unreadable. These were not desperate men. They were determined men. The Rangers understood then that they were not facing a simple nighttime raid. They were facing an organized assault. The Japanese attack plan was clear. They wanted the ridge, and they wanted it before sunrise. They would climb in waves, pushing more and more troops up the slope until the Rangers were crushed by sheer numbers. Sergeant Hale saw all of this in a single glance. He exhaled slowly and steadied the machine gun team. "Not yet," he whispered. The Japanese moved closer. 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 A sudden flare lit the sky, a bursting ball of blinding white light. The ridge glowed. Shadows stretched. Faces became visible. And in that moment, both sides saw each other. It was a moment frozen in time. The Japanese eyes widened. They had not expected to be this close before being seen. The Rangers tightened their grips. They had not expected such a massive force so soon. Then the light faded. And the shouting began. Cries of "Banzai" rose from below as the first wave rushed forward. Sergeant Hale shouted, "Hold! Fire!" The ridge erupted in sound. The machine gun roared. Rifles cracked again and again. Sparks flew from rocks. Dirt burst into the air. The Japanese charged through the bullets, climbing with fierce determination, pushing forward even as bodies fell. The Rangers fought with everything they had, but the truth hit them quickly. This was only the beginning. The night was long. The enemy numbers were endless. And the ridge felt smaller with every wave. But still, they held. They had to. Everything behind them depended on it. And as the first hour of battle raged, both sides realized something they had not known before. This ridge would not fall easily. This night would not end quickly. And these Rangers, these tired, outnumbered men, would fight long past the point where most soldiers break. They were not just holding a ridge. They were holding a line between chaos and survival, between defeat and hope, between losing the island or living to see another sunrise. The night was far from over. And the hardest hours were still to come. The battle on the ridge grew louder with every passing minute. What began as a sudden clash had become a storm, one that crashed again and again against the thin line of men trying to hold the high ground. The air was filled with shouts, gunfire, and the sharp, cracking sound of grenades exploding among tree roots. Smoke drifted through the branches. Sparks lit the darkness. The ridge felt alive, shaking under the weight of each new wave. But inside this chaos were smaller stories, stories of fear, courage, pain, and choices made in seconds that would be remembered for a lifetime. Every Ranger had his own battle inside his mind, and every man had moments that tested the deepest parts of his spirit. Private Miller was one of the youngest men on the ridge. He had turned 19 just 2 weeks before the mission, and he still kept a small birthday letter from his mother in his left breast pocket. As he fired down the slope, he could feel the letter pressed against his chest, slightly damp from sweat. Every time he reloaded, he touched the pocket with his thumb, as if it gave him strength just by being there. He had never seen so many enemy soldiers in one place. He had never heard so many voices yelling at once. And he had never felt fear like this, a fear that did not shake him or freeze him, but instead pushed him forward, forcing him to keep firing even when his hands trembled. When a grenade exploded a few feet away, dirt showered his helmet. A piece of bark cut his cheek. He wiped the blood away without thinking. There was no time to feel pain. There was only time to survive the next second and then the next. Near him, Corporal Reeves crouched behind a fallen log, reloading with steady, practiced motions. Reeves was the calm one, the man who always spoke softly even when others shouted. He had once been a schoolteacher before the war. He still carried a small pencil in his pocket out of habit. Sometimes, when the night grew quiet, he would take it out and write small thoughts in his notebook. About the rain, about home, about the strange beauty of jungles. Tonight there was no notebook. No pencil. Only the rifle in his hands and the men depending on him. When the first wave slowed, Reeves risked looking over the log. He could see shapes scattered across the slope, some still moving, others silent. But farther down below, more soldiers were gathering in the shadows, preparing to climb. He whispered, "They're coming again." And the truth of those words weighed on the entire ridge. The machine gun crew was struggling. The gun barrel was hot, so hot that smoke curled upward every time a new burst fired. The assistant gunner poured water on it again, steam rising like breath into the night. The gunner's gloves were worn thin. The vibrations from the gun rattled his shoulders. Every shot pushed into his bones. But he did not stop. Not even when his arms ached. Not even when his ears rang from the constant explosions. He kept firing, kept sweeping the slope, kept pushing back wave after wave. Behind him, Sergeant Hale moved like a shadow, low to the ground, fast, focused. He checked each position, adjusted each man's placement, made sure no one broke under the pressure. His voice stayed calm even when the world was falling apart around them. Keep your spacing. Save ammo. Wait for them to get close. Don't waste a shot. His presence was steadying. It held the line firm. But even Hale felt the weight of the night. His hands were scratched. His throat burned from shouting. His eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for weaknesses, holes, shadows that didn't look right. He had been through many battles, but never one like this. Never one so uneven, so overwhelming, so relentless. For a brief moment, Hale crouched behind a rock and closed his eyes. Just for a second. Just long enough to breathe. And in that short breath, memories came flooding back. Memories of his wife waiting at home, memories of his father teaching him how to shoot on a dusty field, memories of a younger version of himself who thought war would be an adventure. He opened his eyes. Those memories had to wait. The ridge needed him now. As the second wave crashed into the slope, the night changed again. These soldiers came with greater force. They shouted louder. They moved faster, climbing like men who had nothing to lose. They fired their rifles upward, bullets snapping through the branches. They threw grenades that bounced against the rocks before exploding. Some charged straight through the gunfire, climbing over the fallen as if the ridge belonged to them. The Rangers fought back with everything they had. Private Miller fired until his rifle clicked empty, then ducked to reload. Corporal Reeves dropped 2 attackers with clean, careful shots. The machine gun hammered through the darkness, mowing down the front line of climbers. But still they came. The second wave reached closer than the first. Some Japanese soldiers made it far enough to fire from behind trees. Others crawled through bushes, trying to get above the Rangers' line of fire. One even reached the fallen log where Reeves was positioned. Reeves turned and saw the flash of a bayonet. He swung his rifle like a club, knocking the soldier back. A second Japanese fighter leaped forward. Miller fired just in time, saving Reeves by inches. The battle had become something no man trained for. It was no longer lines of troops. No longer a battlefield with clear sides. It was chaos, close, violent, personal. When the second wave finally broke, the ridge fell into sudden quiet. Not peace, but a strange, heavy silence where the only sounds were breathing and the distant buzz of cicadas. The air seemed thicker now, scented with smoke, sweat, and the sharp metallic smell of spent gunpowder. Some of the Rangers slumped behind cover, catching their breath. Some wiped dirt from their faces. Others sat quietly, staring into the dark valley below, trying to understand what they had just survived. Reeves whispered, "How many more will they send?" No one answered. But everyone knew the truth, as many as it took. Miller looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He tried to steady them, but they kept trembling. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and opened them again. The shaking stopped. Sometimes courage is not loud. Sometimes courage is a quiet moment where a man decides not to give in to fear. Sergeant Hale walked the line again. He checked each man for wounds, grabbed extra ammo boxes, and placed them where they were needed. He moved the machine gun slightly to cover a better angle. He told the medic to check the wounded. He kept his voice calm, even though each small task felt heavier than usual. At the far end of the ridge, a soldier named Daniels lay on his back, staring up at the sky. He had been hit by shrapnel during the second wave. His arm was wrapped in bandages. He wasn't crying, but there were tears in the corners of his eyes, tears he didn't fully understand. He whispered, "Why are they still coming?" The medic knelt beside him. "Because this ridge matters." Daniels nodded slowly, though he didn't feel comforted. And then, something unexpected happened. The sounds of the jungle returned. A frog croaked somewhere in the dark. Leaves rustled softly in the wind. A bird let out a short call. It was almost peaceful, but the Rangers knew better. Peace in war could mean only one thing: the enemy was preparing again. Sergeant Hale gathered his men. He spoke quietly, but every man heard him. "They're not done. There will be a third wave. Maybe more. But we're still here. We're still holding this ridge." His voice grew steadier, stronger. "We hold. We don't break. Not tonight." And in that moment something changed among the Rangers. Their fear did not disappear. Their exhaustion did not fade. But something deeper began to rise. Something like loyalty, something like pride, something like the knowledge that they were fighting for each other, not just for a ridge. When the third wave came, it came differently. There was no shouting at first. No charging footsteps. No sudden rush. Instead, the Japanese soldiers moved quietly, trying to flank the ridge from the side. They crawled through tall grass, using the moonlight to hide their movements. They carried bayonets, knives, and grenades. Many came without helmets. They moved like shadows, slow and deliberate. But Sergeant Hale noticed. He saw shapes moving where there should be none. He heard faint rustles that didn't match the pattern of the wind. He whispered, "Left side. They're coming around. Prepare." The Rangers shifted positions without making noise. They crouched lower, breathing quieter, waiting for the shapes to move closer. And then a single shot rang out. A Japanese soldier fell. The valley erupted. The third wave, silent a moment before, exploded into motion. Soldiers rushed forward with bayonets raised. Grenades arced through the air. The Rangers opened fire. Bullets cut through the night. Sparks burst from rocks. The machine gun ripped through the attackers climbing the side path. This wave came closest of all. A Japanese officer reached the top of the ridge, shouting orders, raising a sword as he charged. He leaped over a rock, landing just feet from Hale. Hale fired once. The officer fell. But another soldier took his place. Then another. Then another. They climbed with terrifying determination, refusing to stop, refusing to break, refusing to accept defeat. The Rangers fought hand to hand. Rifles became clubs. Bayonets clashed. Boots slipped in the mud. Men yelled, pushed, struggled, survived 1 second only to face danger the next. During the fight, Miller tripped and fell backward. A Japanese soldier rushed at him, bayonet aimed at his chest. Miller rolled aside, grabbed a rock, and struck the soldier's hand. Reeves fired a single shot that saved him. The fight was no longer a battle. It was survival, raw, close, breathless. When the third wave fell apart, the ridge was quiet again, but this silence felt different. The night was nearly half over. The moon hung low. The air was colder now. Smoke drifted upward like ghostly shapes. The Rangers sat in the dirt, breathing heavily. Some patched small wounds. Others lay still, listening to their hearts pounding. Sergeant Hale walked to the edge of the ridge and looked down into the darkness. He knew more waves were coming. He could feel it. The Japanese were too determined, too disciplined to stop now. But something inside him shifted. He realized they were still here. Still standing. Still alive. He whispered to himself, "We can do this." And maybe, just maybe, he believed it. The hardest hours were still ahead. The final waves would be the most brutal of all. But something had changed in the hearts of the Rangers. They had faced fear. They had faced death. They had faced impossible odds. And they had not broken. Not yet. The ridge still belonged to them. And dawn, though still far away, had begun its slow crawl toward the horizon. The night on the ridge dragged on, hour after hour, wave after wave. Each attack felt heavier than the last. Each minute stretched into something long and painful, as if time itself was struggling to move forward. The Rangers were exhausted, beyond exhaustion really. Their clothes were torn. Their faces were streaked with dirt and smoke. Their hands shook each time they reloaded. Their ears rang from nonstop gunfire. And yet, somehow they kept fighting. But there comes a moment in every battle where the struggle is no longer just physical. It moves deeper. It begins to shape the mind, the heart, the soul of a person. And on that ridge, in the darkest part of the night, each Ranger reached that moment. For Private Miller, it happened during a quiet pause between waves. He sat with his back against a tree, breathing hard, feeling his heart pounding against his ribs. His hands were blistered. His rifle barrel was too hot to touch. The air smelled of gunpowder and sweat. He watched the valley below, waiting for the next movement. But during that silence, a strange thought came over him. He realized how young he was. How much life he still wanted to see. He wanted to walk in his hometown again. He wanted to see his mother's face. He wanted to marry someone one day. He wanted to do normal things, simple things, things that felt a world away from this ridge. And then he wondered if he would ever have the chance. Fear crept into him. Not fear of bullets, not fear of pain, but fear of leaving the world before truly living in it. He looked at the letter in his pocket and touched it gently. And that tiny piece of paper, written in a careful hand by a mother who believed her son would come home, gave him a strange kind of courage. A soft courage. A courage born from love, not from violence. It kept him steady. Not far from him, Corporal Reeves sat quietly, his rifle across his lap. The moonlight rested on his face. He was thinking of his students, the small classroom he had left behind when the war began. He remembered their bright eyes, their noisy questions, their dreams. He wondered where they were now, how much they had grown, whether they still remembered him. He didn't know if he would see that classroom again. But he knew one thing clearly: if he could survive this night, he would return to teaching. He would bring back stories, not of glory but of courage, fear, and the truth of war. He felt a duty not just to survive, but to live in a way that honored the men beside him. Sergeant Hale had a different kind of reflection. He had seen many battles. He had lost friends on distant shores, watched men collapse from exhaustion, and made decisions that weighed on him even years later. He had learned that war was not made of victories or defeats, it was made of moments. Small, fragile moments where a single choice could save a life or cost one. As Hale walked along the ridge, checking each man, he felt the weight of leadership heavier than ever. These men trusted him. They followed his orders without question. They looked at him as if he always knew the right answer. But Hale knew the truth: he was just a man, tired, scared, dirty, and doing his best. He touched the dirt beneath him. It was cold now, almost comforting. He closed his eyes for a moment and whispered, "Just let them see morning. That's all I want." The jungle seemed to hold that prayer in its leaves. Below the ridge, the Japanese forces prepared again. The officers yelled orders, gathering their men into formation. They were tired too. Many had fallen in the earlier waves. Their uniforms were torn. Their faces were strained. But they believed deeply in their mission. They believed that taking the ridge would turn the tide of the entire battle. For them, honor was more important than rest. Duty was more important than life. The fourth wave began with a sudden blast of rifles firing upward. Bullets zipped past tree trunks. Bark exploded. Leaves fell like rain. The Rangers took cover. Some fired back. The machine gun roared again, though its barrel was close to glowing red. Then the Japanese soldiers began to climb. Fast. Hundreds of them. This wave was different from the others. It was not a rush. It was not a screaming charge. It was slow, controlled, coordinated. They moved in tight groups, spreading across the slope, avoiding the direct line of the machine gun. They used trees and rocks for cover. They climbed like hunters who had studied the ridge carefully. Sergeant Hale felt cold fear rise inside him. "They're learning," he muttered. "They're changing tactics." This was the most dangerous kind of enemy, one that could adapt. The Rangers fired downward. Shots cracked through the air. Shadows fell. But more kept climbing. Closer. Closer. Too close now. A Japanese squad almost reached the top. Hale shouted, "Left side." "They're breaking through." Reeves and Miller swung their rifles and fired. The machine gun team shifted their aim. The medic grabbed a fallen rifle and helped hold the line from behind a tree. The fighting became desperate. At one point, Miller slipped on the loose soil and fell hard. A Japanese soldier rushed him. Miller raised his rifle, but it jammed. Panic stabbed through him. He grabbed a stone and struck the soldier's hand. Reeves fired, saving him again. The ridge had become chaos. But slowly, painfully, the fourth wave broke apart. The Japanese soldiers pulled back, disappearing into the darkness below. The jungle fell silent again, but the silence felt thin, fragile, temporary. The Rangers had survived another wave. But at what cost? 2 men were badly wounded. The medic worked quickly, hands shaking from exhaustion. He tied bandages, stopped bleeding, whispered comforting words even when he knew the truth was grim. One wounded man reached out and grabbed his arm. "Don't let me die," he whispered. "You're not going anywhere," the medic said, though his own eyes were wet. Everyone knew the hardest part of war was not the fighting, it was what came after the fighting. The waiting. The uncertainty. the fear of the next moment. Hours passed. The stars moved across the sky. The air grew colder. The ridge remained quiet. Too quiet. Every man felt the same thing. The biggest wave had not come yet. When it did, it came like an earthquake. A sudden shout rose from the valley. Then hundreds of footsteps thundered up the slope. The Japanese soldiers charged in a giant wave, larger than all the others combined. They shouted, screamed, roared with all their strength. They fired rifles upward. They threw grenades that bounced wildly among the Ranger positions. The ridge shook under the weight of their assault. The Rangers fired until their rifles smoked. The machine gun tore through the front line. But the attackers kept coming. They climbed over rocks, over fallen bodies, over each other. They reached the ridge. Hand-to-hand combat erupted. Men struggled in the dirt. Bayonets flashed. Rifle stocks cracked. Boots slipped on the steep ground. The air was filled with the sounds of grunts, impacts, shouts of pain, and desperate breaths. Sergeant Hale found himself tackling a soldier who swung a bayonet at him. They rolled in the dirt. Hale grabbed a rock and struck the soldier's arm. The soldier stumbled. Hale pushed him back down the slope. But another soldier lunged at him. And another. And another. Yet somehow, the Rangers held. They pushed back. They fought with the last of their strength. They used every ounce of fear and courage inside them. They formed a thin line shoulder to shoulder, refusing to let the ridge fall. And after what felt like hours, though it was only minutes, the final wave broke. The Japanese soldiers began to retreat. Slowly at first, then faster, until the entire slope was empty again except for the dead and the wounded. The ridge was quiet. Truly quiet. Not the tense quiet from before. Not the heavy, waiting silence. This was different. The attack was over. The battle was won. The Rangers collapsed where they stood. Miller sat down hard, breathing so fast he felt lightheaded. Reeves leaned against a tree and closed his eyes. The machine gun crew lay flat on their backs, staring at the stars. Hale dropped to his knees and rested his hands on the dirt. The night sky began to lighten just a little. A faint gray glow touched the horizon. Dawn was coming. The first bird of the morning sang a single, soft note. Then another joined. Then another. The jungle slowly came alive again, as if the land itself had survived a terrible nightmare and now dared to breathe again. The men looked at the sunrise with disbelief. They had made it. Against impossible odds. Against 2,000 soldiers. Against fear, exhaustion, and the weight of the night. They had held the ridge. As the sun rose, Hale stood slowly, painfully, and looked at his men. "You did it," he said quietly. "Every one of you. You held." Miller looked at his hands. They were still shaking. But he also felt them steadying as the warm light touched them. Reeves watched the sunlight filter through the trees and felt the strange mixture of sadness and pride that comes after surviving something impossible. And then the realization came. They were alive. They would see another day. The price had been terrible. Lives had been lost. Wounds would last forever. But the ridge was still in American hands. The valley behind them was safe. And the story of what happened that night would live far longer than any one of them. The ridge would become a symbol, not of victory alone, but of human strength, human fear, and the strange truth that sometimes the smallest group of people can hold back a storm if they have no other choice. As the Rangers gathered their wounded and prepared to move down the ridge, the sunlight spread across the battlefield. It touched the fallen. It warmed the earth. It brought a quiet, solemn peace to a place that had known only chaos hours before. Sergeant Hale looked back one last time at the ridge. He placed a hand on a nearby tree, feeling the rough bark under his fingers. "This place will remember us," he whispered. Perhaps it would. Perhaps the world forgets many battles, but the land remembers the footsteps, the struggle, the sacrifice. And somewhere in the heart of every soldier who survived, the ridge would live forever. As the Rangers walked away, the narrator's voice rises gently. And so ends the night the ridge refused to fall. A night where courage was not loud but steady. Where fear walked beside every man but did not break them. Where a handful of Rangers stood against a force far larger than themselves, and endured. This is not just a story of war. It is a story of human strength. of loyalty, of the will to survive, and of the quiet truth that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not for glory, not for fame, but simply for the people standing next to you. The ridge still stands today, silent, green, peaceful. But if you listen closely, if you let the wind pass through the leaves, you can almost hear the echoes of that night. The struggle, the courage, the heartbeat of men who refused to let darkness win. They did not fight for medals. They did not fight for praise. They fought because they had to, because someone had to hold the ridge. And they did. As dawn rises over the jungle, their story rises with it. A story of hope in the darkest hours, a story of endurance, a story of the human spirit refusing to fall. And that is how one Ranger squad held a ridge against 2,000 soldiers, and carved their place into history.